Right. Well, Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
So,
for having me. I appreciate it.
of course, so excited to hear from you today. I've been looking forward to this conversation all week. You bring so much to the executive recruiting space, and I will include a full bio and link to your LinkedIn in the notes below. But why don't we just start off? How did you get into the space that you're in and really starting? And I mean, Turning Point, how many years? It's been 10 years in business?
15, actually, yeah. And
15?
next
Holy
month, yeah,
smokes.
yeah, next
Wow.
month is our 15th anniversary. So time flies
Wow.
when you're having fun, right?
Yes, congratulations. So
Thank
share
you,
a little
thank
bit
you.
more about Turning Point and how it got to this the foundation to where it is today. So love to hear a little bit more and what you all do.
Sure, sure. Yeah, thanks. And again, thanks for the invitation to chat today. I really appreciate it. But yeah, so I've been in the recruiting business now for 25 years, but 15 as far as Turning Point goes. And I always wanted to have my own business. That was always my goal from when I was a teenager, growing up in a very entrepreneurial household with a Jack in the Box franchisee for a dad and an interior decorator for a mom. So entrepreneurism is kind of in my DNA. But yeah, we've kind of ebbed and flowed and expanded over the years, of the 15 years as Turning Point. We started off doing mainly accounting and finance recruiting in the early days, and then I did a complete rebrand and pivot. Something that you're very familiar with as far as branding goes.
Mhm.
Changed around back in 2011, 2012. So it's been 10 years since we actually made the move over to sales and marketing and operations recruiting. And we don't do as much accounting and finance these days. So a bit of a pivot and a rebrand there. But it's been great. It's been a lot of fun. I get to meet a ton of really great people. This time in particular, I always say it's a really good time to be in the people business
Yeah.
because there's so much happening out there and so many trends that are going on, partly because of COVID and partly just because of the changing demographics. So I really do enjoy it. It's very fulfilling and very engaging.
Yeah. So let's jump in. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the trends, especially with the Great Resignation going on and COVID. I mean, hiring is challenging. So what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, it really is. There's so many moving parts. It's really difficult for. I really feel for a lot of employers out there that are trying to get their arms around everything out there, whether it's regard to DEI and building a more diversified workforce, or whether it's trying to retain the people that you already have because they can go somewhere else and get a 20 or 30% bump in salary, or then trying to bring in new talent as well. Even people that are doing the same job that they already have somebody on board doing today, but it costs them again 20% more to hire a new person as compared to their incumbent. So there's a lot that employers have to really grapple with right now. But work from home is a big part of that. To your point, no longer are people just willing to, without questioning, willing to just work from the office 5 days a week. And we tell clients on a regular basis that if you want us to recruit somebody for your position and you're requiring them to be in the office 5 days a week, we can do it. But A, it's going to be much more difficult. B, it's going to take a lot more time. And C, they're going to have a lot fewer candidates to look at in terms of their pool of candidates because there are fewer people that are willing to consider that kind of a scenario where they have to be in the office 5 days a week. So it's tough.
I bet those are conversations that you were not having just a few years ago,
Right,
or were
exactly.
they? I mean, is this just it's kind of this mega trend of new work
Right.
life? Yeah.
Well, it was a trend that was starting to take hold pre-pandemic, but mainly from the candidate side. There were candidates, especially in sales and marketing as well, to that respect, that were saying, hey, I'd rather not have to go to the office every single day if I don't have to. Especially if you're in sales and you're traveling around to different clients anyway, there's not really a lot of value in being in the office. But it was really difficult pre-COVID to find companies, hiring managers, leaders, CEOs that were willing to let their staff work remotely. Unless they already had a remote field sales team, they were already used to that. That's one thing, but most companies were not. And so that was the challenge. It was a little more on demand side, but not as much on the supply side in terms of opportunities and jobs that would allow for that. But then, COVID comes along and just changes everything completely and accelerates that trend beyond anybody's wildest imagination. And now, the majority of companies have realized that their people are just as, if not more productive working from home. People are certainly happier about it. They're engaged. They don't have to, spend and waste their time driving to an office every single day. But companies are also having to adjust how they manage And there's definitely something to be said for the loss of collaboration and creativity if you're not together as often. So it's requiring a change in how we manage as leaders, and how we engage our team and how we create that collaborative space.
And uh, how are you filtering for that? I mean, I assume a lot of this comes down to values of the company and trying to pull that out within the prospective candidates. But what sort of things are you filtering for with this new world that we're living in to see if that would be a good fit, that virtual environment, or even just a good
Yeah.
fit for the company?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really kind of depends on the organization, but also on the position itself, the function. For example, we have a lot of tech clients, but we also have a lot of manufacturing clients as well. And the manufacturing clients, while we don't recruit for warehouse positions or frontline workers as far as being on the manufacturing floor, a lot of the folks that we are recruiting are leading those kinds of teams, right? And so if the leader's not in the office, then why should the team be? So there's a little bit of a challenge there. And so to your question about filtering, we have to really kind of dig more deeply into why is the role that you want us to recruit for you? Why does it have to be in the office? What's the dynamic around that? Is it a turnaround situation? Is it an early stage company where they have to build up a team? And so having that physical presence with the rest of the executive leadership team is really important. Okay, that makes some sense. If the answer is, well, it's always been this way, COVID was a goofy blip on the radar screen, we're all going back to being in the office 5 days a week, that's a different story. And that's where you have a much harder time, or we have a much harder time finding candidates that are willing to do that, if there's no real compelling reason behind it.
Yeah, that's fair. So it's really unique to each company situation and
Right,
sort of what's
exactly.
going
Yeah.
on.
And I think, right now, it's kind of this confluence of things. So you've got this work from home dynamic, which is brand new. On top of that, you also have this, very, very real war for talent. And there's a big shortage out there for qualified people, regardless of the function in the industry. And so companies that may have been more stringent about certain things pre-pandemic or when the labor market wasn't so tight, now they're having to relax those kinds of things, to get anybody to even be interested in the job, because the supply of people is so short. Even things, for example, like drug screenings, right, which was the norm across the variety of all industries, pre-pandemic.
Right.
But with COVID and the labor shortage, and on top of that, more and more states legalizing marijuana, obviously, companies are having to adjust that. And so now you don't have to have a drug screen every single time, or maybe you don't have to have a college degree for a lot of the jobs. They realize that a college degree is not a bad thing, but it's not really an absolute must to do the job. So companies are having to adjust their criteria a little bit, with their own filters when they hire people.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, each, as you were alluding to each company is so different, right? The leadership team, the culture, the values, all of that. As a partner with them and helping them to identify how to build their team, how are you like pulling back layers of the onion to really get a pulse on the company, just how they work, how they communicate their values, so that you're able to create that best fit for them for longevity? What sort of steps do you all take to, look under the hood?
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I mean, we've done this for such a long time that we know certain cues when somebody is kind of BSing us, and it's not exactly the true, complete truth, right?
Yeah.
But you also look at, what's the average tenure of this company. When we talk to a company, whether it's professional or financial services or manufacturing or anybody else, what's the reason that the job is open? What's compelling them to hire this role? If they say, well, we've had 3 sales managers in this role in the last 18 months or last 2 years, and none of them are good enough, well, that's a pretty big red flag, right? So that's some insight into the culture out there. If the company's going through a changeover in leadership, that's some insight as well. If the hiring manager that we're working with, is giving us this laundry list of requirements for the position, and we push back and say, well, you can have 6 of those things, but not all 15. If they're not willing to be open to that conversation, if they're not coachable, as we call it, if they're not willing to accept our feedback as the experts in the marketplace, then it's probably not the best client for us to work with. because it's going to be very frustrating for us and for them because we can't find this perfect person out there because they're being so restrictive.
That makes sense. And then it would probably be
Yeah.
personality cues for the type
Right.
of person you need to hire to be able to work with that type of team or what have you. So,
Exactly. And it takes more time. To your question, it takes more time for us to peel back those layers. And it's
yeah,
not just, give us a job description. Okay, we're gonna go off and start recruiting now. It's we have an hour long, we call it kickoff call, usually over Zoom, right?
right.
But it's a more in-depth conversation after we've already decided through my previous calls with them that they are the right fit. Then we dive even deeper into the actual position and the company culture with that kickoff call before we actually go out to market and start to recruit for that position.
Okay. And then can you share a little bit more about that out to market piece of it too? What are you doing to be able to solicit that talent? I know you talked earlier about how you're having those challenging conversations and also creating transparency around the trends of what's happening in the marketplace, right? Which might help to shake, like you said, to bend on expectations, if you will, that
Right,
may have
right.
been folks may have put a line in the sand previously. Once you've had that, and once you're at a point where you're actually going to find that talent, what all are you doing, and how are you screening for that talent with those criteria that have been laid down? So,
Yeah, so it's and that's really kind of where the secret sauce is, so to speak. That's why clients hire us. Many of our clients actually have their own internal HR or what's called TA or talent acquisition teams. But when they have a situation where it's a very high impact, high sense of urgency position, or it's a role where they just don't have the bandwidth to do the search, they come to us, right? And so they come to us because of our ability to source candidates and then also screen the people that we do find. So, because we're more specialized firm, we have a pretty sizable database, as you might expect. So we look at our database for people that we know that could be the right fit or that could be a referral point. But we also tell our clients that even though we've got a very deep database, the best person for that job may not be someone that we already know. So we don't want to limit the folks that we're going to consider for the job to just the folks that we already know. Let's
yeah,
look at the full universe. So our database is one component of that searching. The other one is social media, being LinkedIn. And so we rely very heavily on LinkedIn to compare those people that are out there to the folks that we already know. And so that's a big part of it, is kind of knowing how to find these people. When I got into recruiting 25 years ago, there was no LinkedIn, right? It was all
right.
good old fashioned phone calls, right? And so back then, the secret sauce behind the value that we bring to the table was trying to figure out who to go after, trying to figure out who are the key players. If a company is looking for someone in their competitive landscape, who are the right people in those competitors that I should go after. These days with LinkedIn and just the internet in general, it's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier to figure out who to go after, who to target. But now the secret sauce, the value add, is the messaging. How do I compel, a high performing VP of marketing to respond to my outreach when they're also getting, kind of bombarded by 10, 15 other recruiters and companies that are hiring at the same time? So
Yeah.
that messaging is really important for us. And so we have to really know what it is that's going to compel them to respond, and kind of what their hot buttons are depending upon their function. So then once we find them, then the next phase is obviously the screening process. And we go pretty deep. So we do a phone screening for about an hour. We have them complete a customized client questionnaire that asks even more in-depth questions about their fit for the role. And if we like that, then we do a virtual Zoom interview as well. So we've usually spent between 3 and 4 hours with every candidate before we present them to our client.
That's fair. To go back to the point about the messaging, I think that can't be undervalued or underappreciated. I think, you see a lot of just mass see what works these days,
Mhm.
especially with email and being in the digital world. And you can't take out that personalization and the human element. I think of like you said, really being able to connect with people and the eye to be able to see if that might be a good candidate. I'm sure that's something that only takes years of experience, I'm sure. So
Right. Yeah, and you just have to ask questions. I mean, your phrase that you use, peel back the layers. That's what we use. We say the same thing internally. When you ask somebody a question, you're trying to screen them for a certain job. You can't just take their first response at face value. You've got to say, okay, so tell me more. Why did it happen that way? Who else was involved? What were the challenges along the way? One of the big questions that we ask is, so tell me about your last 3 deals, whether you're in sales or marketing or operations, your last 3 initiatives. And then with that question, it's a pretty simple question, but you really glean a lot of insight about the individual. Are they taking credit for everything and blaming other people for the bad things? Is it more inclusive? Are they more of a we kind of person versus I?
Yeah.
What do they attribute their success to? Those kind of things. So you really get a good sense for who they are as an individual.
Yeah, that's fair. And I would assume also it helps to color if the cultural fit would be a good fit as
Right.
well, right? And that value set.
Exactly.
So,
Right. And there's a lot of people. I mean, we work with a lot of mid-market companies, so a lot of our clients are, on the low end 10 million, and on the high end about $1 billion in revenue. And so, people that come from very large organizations, from Microsoft or from Dell or from wherever, they many times say, "Yeah, I want to work for a smaller company." And we have to really explain to them, okay, when you say that, that means you're going to have a company where there's 100 employees total. Whereas at Microsoft, you have an
very
IT
different.
team alone of 5,000 people, or whatever the number is. So it's very, very different. You've got to be truly, understanding of what that means, how that dynamic is going to change, and how hands-on you're going to have to be to really survive in a smaller company.
Yeah, that's very fair. And then I love to hear a little bit more too, just about DEI and hiring, and if there's
Mhm.
anything that you all have folded into your processes, if you're how you're, maybe interviewing folks or scanning resumes or that sort of thing, or if that's been a conversation that's come up. So
It has, quite a bit actually. And we spent about 6 months or so researching, trying to figure out, what can we do to help with DEI hiring.
mhm,
And it's obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And we're in a pretty unique position as a recruiter, because we can help impact that with our clients, obviously. And many of our clients, because they are mid-market, many of them don't have a formal strategy, if you will. So as an example, one of the things that we are now doing as the result of all the research that we did over the last 6 months or so, is that when we present our first batch of candidates to our client, we used to send them, the full resume along with a link to the person's LinkedIn profile,
mhm,
right? And a lot of times it's not deliberate, but a lot of unconscious bias creeps in when any of us are doing any kind of hiring. You want to hire somebody who came from a similar school, grew up in a
mhm,
similar, part of the country,
yep,
looks and sounds like you, and has a similar background. It's just very unconscious, right? But that ends up, resulting in weeding out people that are different. That are different ethnicities, different gender, different backgrounds, whatever it might be, unconsciously. And so we are now changing that up, so that when we present our first batch of candidates to our client, we are not including the person's name, right, or location where they live or anything like that. They have the full resume, but just not the person's contact information. And we're not sending out the LinkedIn profile. We
mhm,
want our client to decide which of our candidates to interview based solely on the merit of their background.
mm,
Then once you say, great, I want to meet candidate 1 and candidate 3 and candidate 4, then we'll, obviously say, okay, here's the individual. We'll include the full, information about the person. And that point, then we can at least, we know they're interviewing people for that reason. We also then talk, very candidly with our clients about, how diversified is your workforce? Would
mhm,
it be helpful? Do you need to really do a better job of bringing in more people of color, or do you how many women do you have in leadership positions? What
mhm.
does that career track look like, that upper mobility? So just being willing to have that conversation really goes a long way.
Yeah.
And then doing things like the resume screening is helping quite a bit also.
How has it been received? Do you have different reactions from before or pushback or any of that?
Yeah, so of the several dozen folks I've talked to, 90% of them are very receptive to that. They like that idea. They appreciate it. They've been trying to figure out ways that they can also improve their own diversity hiring. I would say 10% of the time they say, I'm not sure how that would work, and I'd be curious to see how that goes. Or yeah, let's try it and see what happens. So they're a little bit more skeptical or uncertain about it. But the majority of folks have received it very, very well, for sure.
Yeah.
And the other piece of it is that, I mean, there's three different pieces, right? There's, how do you source your talent? Where do you get your talent from? So a lot of us tend to use, like I said, LinkedIn or our database. If my LinkedIn network is comprised of a lot of other similar aged white males,
Mhm.
then most likely the folks I'm going to be pulling from in my recruiting are similar, because that's the network I'm pulling from.
Mhm.
Right. And so I've got to do a better job of diversifying my own network, my own, ecosystem, if you will, so I can pull from a broader class of people. We need to look at, recruiting, deliberately recruiting from historically Black colleges or Hispanic colleges or whatever that demographic might look like, so that we can bring a more diverse slate of candidates, to our companies, to our clients as well. And that just takes some time. It just does. It just takes time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that insight too.
Yeah, sure.
Any other trends or challenges that would be helpful to share as we look ahead with it's a wild world we live in, especially these last few years with COVID and all of that. What would be smart for folks to be thinking about with hiring or just things to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about hiring, and there's a lot of things that are out there. I think on the retention side, it's also really important. With the great resignation and reshuffle, whatever term you want to use, right? There's a lot of people that are changing jobs, an awful lot of people at a record number, right? And I think a lot of employers feel like they don't have much control. That's kind of, it is what it is. If they're going to leave, they're going to leave. But, you can do some very small things to really make a difference. Most importantly, just communicate. Right. So I have this mantra I've been using now where it's, take notice before they give notice. In other words, take notice of your key players, your A players, your top performers, acknowledge them before they're sitting across the table from you, handing you their, letter of resignation.
Yeah.
You don't have to have an hour-long discussion every single week, but once a month, identify your key players, the folks that you really can't afford to lose, and identify them. And once a month, once every 6 weeks, have some kind of a touch point, a phone call, a Zoom, a conversation, coffee if you're in the same city, whatever it is, just to kind of keep them engaged and find out what's happening with them. How is their family? Take the time to learn about what's important to them. Don't apply a one-size-fits-all management style to all of your employees, right? That was maybe okay 20 or 30 years ago. Today, people want to know that what's important to them. Some people value compensation, and other people value, a commute. Others want upward mobility. Others want to learn different things and get a broader exposure. So you have to take the time as a leader, as a manager now, to really know your staff and then, engage with them. And people are still going to leave, right? That's inevitable, but you can really stem that tide quite a bit if you take extra time to communicate with them and stay in touch on a regular basis. So that's a trend I think that is certainly here to stay. It's not a COVID related thing. It may have been accelerated by that or sparked by that, but that's just the new dynamic of the workforce today.
Yeah, that's so true. There's an article I was reading recently and it talked about is something like, what do employees want, the most, some sort of headline like that. And it was just about human to human connection.
Mhm.
It's not always about, being in the room with the senior leadership or this or that, but sometimes it's just about how are you doing? How's your family? It's building those relationships that create connectivity.
Right.
And so just to your point earlier but like you said, I don't think that's COVID specific. It's just probably more chatter right now with everything.
Right. Well, the days of leading the way that Jack Welch led, right, where it's, you have A, B's and C players and the C's are already out, either you're up or you're out kind of thing, where you didn't bring your whole self to work as a leader. You weren't really allowed to be vulnerable. Everybody thought that was a weakness if you talked about your family or personal things. Right. Or you said, gosh, I'm really struggling right now, or things are difficult. That was the way it was, again, 20, 30 years ago. Today, if you're not willing to be vulnerable and bring your whole self to work, and I'm not saying wear your emotion on your sleeve and air your dirty laundry, but you've got to be willing to talk about you as an individual and your employees as individuals, as people, not just as numbers or a cog in a very large wheel. Those are the leaders they're doing a great job. There's a great book I just read by Hubert Jolly, who was the CEO and really drove the turnaround at Best Buy. He was also at Gartner for a long time and at Carlson Wagonlit Travel also, talking. And the book is called The Heart of Business. And it's literally around the heart, right? The people side of your people, and how important that really is, and how, the old mantra that, employees come last and your shareholders are first, customers are second, that's all been turned on its head. And you've got to look at your employees first, because if your employees are happy, then, revenue, profit, happy customers will follow. Inevitably, it will happen. So I'm a very big believer and follower of what he's talking about in that book.
Yeah, I think to quote, I think my husband says it's something like it's not just about the people, it's all about the people, you know?
Right,
So
exactly. Yeah,
I
for
mean, it
sure.
really,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
a great way to put it. Yeah.
relationship. So, oh, that's great. Well, Ken, thank you so much. I just really appreciate your time today and sharing a little bit more of behind the scenes about what you all do, what's happening, what you're seeing in the market today. It's so timely with just so much disruption, if you will, or just so many changes that are happening across industries. So thank you for taking the time and sharing a little bit more.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the invite and for the great conversation. I appreciate it.
Always good to see you.
You too. Take care.